Unit 4 Environmental Perception and Cognition. 4.0 Introduction. Psychologists may engage with the environment at a macro level, studying human-nature interactions, climate change, global warming and such issues, or they may engage at the socio-physical level, managing social space with respect to crowding, territoriality, the physical setting of everyday life, or they may also engage at a micro level, studying individual level variables that affect human environment interactions such as perceptual processes, spatial cognition, personality, etc. In this unit we shall engage with the last approach, dealing with micro-level variables, and trace how the understanding of these processes have historically evolved. We shall also study limitations of this approach and understand the latest applications of environmental psychology that have emanated from this area of research on microprocesses. 4.1 Definition and characteristics of environmental perception. Traditionally, perception is understood as originating from a stimulus in the environment about which various informational media carry messages to the sensory organs. Further processing of stimulus features takes place in the human organism, and perception is said to occur when a perceptual object that is outside in the environment is created in the observer that reflects the properties of the external world. This process, when specific to apprehending the features of the environment, is known as environmental perception. When apprehension of features of the environment involves questions related to identity, pattern, form and movement, they are related to environmental perception. Environmental cognition involves formulating hypotheses, making further decisions, and working on goals based on information obtained through environmental perception. An example of a question related to environmental perception would be: did I just hear a tire burst? Or was this a gunshot? Perceptual cognition would involve goal-related questions like: should I get out of the car and check? Should I flee as soon as possible? Environmental perception has immense value for human survival as well as for human social life. Historically, however, the study of environmental perception and cognition has been a somewhat marginalized topic. Most early studies have been carried out within the experimental stimulus-response model. With the growth of environmental psychology, there has been increasing attention to the spatio-physical characteristics of the environment in which behavior occurs, rather than treating the environment only as an extraneous variable. There have been two main traditions of research: the psychology of perception, where the environment is conceptualized in physical perceptual terms, and social psychological tradition, which has a relatively molar stance. In the next few sections, we will give a broad overview of some major thinkers within each of these two traditions and trace the movement of theorizing in environmental psychology from narrow, physical terms to broader social terms. 4.1.1 The physical perceptual view. The physical perceptual tradition is concerned with the correspondence between psychological characteristics and physical properties of the environment, and has also been called the inside-outside problem. Egon Brunswick was an early thinker in this tradition who emphasized the need to consider the objective physical characteristics of the environment rather than those of the observer. Environmental perception, according to him, is a process of making sense of cues coming from the environment. And since not all cues have equal ecological validity, that is, they may vary with respect to degree of correspondence with characteristics of the actual environment, cognitive processes are always probabilistic according to Brunswick, and perception is almost a feat. By highlighting the central role of the observer in making sense of the probabilistic process, Brunswick provided an active role to humans which is markedly different from the passive reactive role accorded to humans in the behaviorist tradition. Thus, here we notice a shift away from stimulus-response view of environment-human relationship. In the organismic end of the perceptual process also there is a weak correlation between proximal means and distal results, between peripheral and central processes, according to Brunswick. The observer is thus continuously involved in hypothesis testing about equivocal correspondences. Brunswick believes that the actor tends to verify the accuracy of the probabilistic judgment by engaging in actions in the environment which confirm the functional validity of the perceptual achievement. According to Gibson's theory of direct perception, the environment supplies all the necessary information that is required for perception and there is no role of inferential or any other higher-order cognitive processing. Sufficient contextual information exists in the environment which may be used directly. Biological adaptation processes prepare humans for picking depth and distance cues which further help them to directly perceive distance from and between objects which help us navigate the environment. Perception happens on the basis of our analysis of the stable relationships among features of objects and settings in the real world. Ulrich Nietzsche distinguishes between perception which is based upon information from the environment and categorization which is based on top-down cognitive process. According to Nietzsche, cognitive inferential processes are anchored to the socio-cultural characteristics of the context. Nietzsche is an exponent of the constructivist approach to cognitive phenomena. The physical perceptual perspective on environmental perception is valuable, although specific consideration of the social and historical cultural aspects of the environment, where both the physical perceptual phenomena and the individual are placed, is missing. 4.1.2 The social psychological view. In the social psychological perspective on environmental perception, Kurt Lewin's field theory is the first and also the most influential theory. Lewin was very critical of the objective behaviorism of perceptual studies in psychology and insisted that all behavior is a function of person as well as the environment. Lewin's field approach considers the physical characteristics of the environment as important and treats elements of the environment as psychological, not as physical objective data. Perceived reality or the psychological environment is given prominence in Lewinian tradition through the concept of psychological ecology. Lewin believed that the physical and social characteristics of the environment have an explanatory role in the psychological environment. This psychosocial understanding of Lewin paved the way for action research or socially relevant psychological research, particularly planned change or social engineering. Roger Barker, being a student of Lewin, emphasized the role of the environment in determining individual behavior, assigning it a role equally important to that of personal factors. He was opposed to the use of the experimental method and the use of individual-level explanatory variables like personality in explanation of human behavior. Barker employed naturalistic observation to obtain specimen record or very detailed, minute observational record of behavior as it occurred in the behavior setting, which was his unit of study. Through his studies, Barker established that the place or setting of behavior was the strongest influence on behavior. Yuri Bronfenbrenner conceptualized the relationship between person and environment in terms of systems and subsystems within the system which interact with each other. Systems and subsystems are therefore interdependent and therefore have reciprocal influence. Through his systemic perspective, Bronfenbrenner critiqued the unidirectional influence models which are characteristic of hard sciences and instead aligned with the biological sciences where bidirectional effects are noticeable. It also points out how the spatio-physical features of the environment organized in a molar sense constitute both second-order and first-order effects on individual behavior. Thus, we see that conceptions of the human-environment interaction have become more systemic or molar with time. Stokols has raised a call for developing a nomenclature that would adequately describe the socio-physical environment and the ways in which socio-physical features of the environment influence individuals' development, behavior and well-being. Researchers have been interested in whether the capacity to accurately discern the environmental situation is present at birth or if it is acquired later during development. 4.2 Perspectives on development of environmental perception. 4.2.1 Ontogenetic perspective. One of the earliest research in psychology about spatial perception was by Jean Piaget and Inhelder. According to Piaget, children's environmental knowledge is acquired through opportunities for action/exploration which are provided during early childhood. Given an appropriate combination of a child's physical maturation and exposure to environmental stimulation, cognitive potentials including the capacity for spatial perception unfolds in a stage-appropriate manner. This is an ontogenetic perspective. Qualitative changes in spatial perception can be seen as the child passes through different stages of cognitive development. According to Piaget, a child reaches adult level of competence in spatial understanding only when he attains the age of 9 or 10 years. Piaget used the famous three-mountain task to show that in early life the child's understanding of space is limited and disorganized. In the three-mountain task, a child is presented with a display of 3 model mountains and a doll is placed at different points around the mountain. The child is required to reorganize the display of mountains to form what they think the mountains look like from the doll's standpoint. To control for the difference that may arise between spatial storage and spatial products, Piaget and Inhelder also gave the children the option of selecting from a set of pictures the picture they think matched the doll's perspective, and also allowed the children to reposition the doll in such a way so as to create a match with viewpoint presented in a particular picture. It was found that children of around 4 years of age assumed that the doll sees the 3 mountains in exactly the same way as the child herself sees. In other words, there was evidence of egocentrism or the inability to distinguish one's own view from the view of the doll. According to Piaget, in early life young children have a sensorimotor understanding as opposed to a metric understanding of the spatial world. Children hence are able to understand topological concepts, which objects are closer in proximity, which are enclosed by one another, the sequence or separation of objects, etc. However, there is no Euclidean understanding of space at an early age. According to Piaget, children begin to understand space and environment only after object permanence, or the idea that objects continue to exist even if they may not be in sight, has been attained. Following the same ontogenetic logic of Piaget, Siegel and White proposed a 5-stage model of the development of cognitive mapping ability. With overall cognitive development, the child develops capacity for symbolic abstraction and logical thinking, and parallel to this process, development of spatial perceptual skills also takes place. In the first stage, the child develops a photographic knowledge or memory of single and isolated points of reference in environmental space, that is, develops photographic memory of landmarks. In the second stage, B, the child is able to make use of the single points of space / landmarks as references for organizing routes. In the third stage, C, distinct and limited parts of the environment can be integrated to form D, route knowledge. At this stage, children learn the sequence of direction choices at intersections and are able to mentalize where in the route they have to turn left, right or go straight. The last ability that is developed is E, the ability to coordinate routes in the area of this system to form a cognitive map of the environment. This cognitive map is holistic, based on survey knowledge. It is independent of the wayfinder's own position and enables the wayfinder to develop shortcuts, find alternative routes to the destination and generally navigate the whole environment successfully. Although there is some support from developmental psychology that landmark knowledge emerges first followed by route knowledge and survey knowledge, there is no support for the idea that adult wayfinders or travelers in a new city, for example, may also be developing cognitive maps of the environment in the same fashion in stages. 4.2.2 Nativist perspective. According to the nativist position, children have an innate capacity for spatial perception which is independent of physical maturation as well as of learning opportunities. Along these lines, nativist theorists, Landor, Gleitman, and Spelk showed that understanding of Euclidean or metric properties of space are not vision-dependent, and that even at an early age of 2.5 years a visually impaired child is able to decipher distance and angular relationship among familiar paths, decipher spatial relationship between objects, and make further inferences about metric properties to navigate an unfamiliar path. This finding clearly does not agree with Piaget's maturation contingent perspective on cognitive and spatial development. Other researchers from the nativist tradition have experimentally shown that very young children are able to make use of geometric information to navigate space while not being able to make use of non-geometric information such as color or odor. Developmental processes enable the child later in life to make use of non-geometric information. This research also clearly does not agree with Piaget's topological assumptions about spatial understanding in early childhood. Although the nativist theorists, through their carefully designed experimental studies, have greatly enhanced the understanding of children's spatial perceptions and have clarified several misconceptions about children's spatial understanding, the nativist theories have largely failed to pay attention to the role of environmental factors and developmental processes in helping the child attain mastery over skills which may be present in early life only in nascent form. Some researchers have also raised doubts about the specific geometric modularity claim made by nativists with respect to space perception. 4.2.3 Learning perspective. In contrast with the nativist theories, the learning theory approach emphasizes the importance of cultural guidance in spatial learning and spatial thinking. Gavin, for example, described how in everyday problem-solving tasks such as giving directions, planning, executing an action sequence, and wayfinding, people make use of social and cultural information. Cognitive mapping therefore is influenced by the goals, communication conventions of the cultural context in which it occurs. Through empirical research, Gavin demonstrated that the understanding of representations, for example, of maps, requires understanding first that the map is a depiction of the real world, and second, also understanding the meaning behind the representation. Understanding this meaning is facilitated by the process of scaffolding, in which experienced cultural members implicitly and explicitly guide and support the younger members through language-based communication. However, all of these processes have a tendency to go unnoticed, unacknowledged, as cultural tools have a seamless presence in human cognitive interpretative processes, so much so that their mediational role may be largely overlooked. The learning theory perspective is valuable for drawing attention to socio-cultural aspects of the environment. However, by stressing the importance of language, scaffolding, and other cultural artifacts, this perspective discounts the importance of direct feedback the children receive from their environment as they go about active exploration. The adaptive value of spatial representations and spatial thought is also largely ignored in this perspective. 4.2.4 Interactionist perspective. A middle ground between the nativist and learning perspectives is provided by interactionist theories. These theories are much more comprehensive in scope and posit that ontogeny, neural maturation, environmental facilitation, and cultural guidance all combine to contribute to spatial development, and none of these can be privileged more than the other. 4.3 Environmental cognition. Environmental cognition refers to various interpretative, decision-making and goal-oriented behavior humans engage in while navigating the physical environment. It is beyond the perceptual factors and involves processes such as cognitive mapping, environmental evaluation, environmental risk perception, perception of air/water quality, temporal pessimism, etc. In the following section we will study cognitive mapping as an example of environmental cognition. 4.3.1 Cognitive maps. A cognitive map is a mental representation of the spatial environment along with representation of key elements of the environment, relative locations etc. which help any individual navigate the space. According to the American Psychological Association, cognitive maps are a mental understanding of an environment, formed through trial and error as well as observation. The concept is based on the assumption that an individual seeks and collects contextual clues, such as environmental relationships, rather than acting as a passive receptor of information needed to achieve a goal. Human beings and other animals have well-developed cognitive maps that contain spatial information enabling them to orient themselves and find their way in the real world. Symbolism and meaning are also contained in such maps. 4.3.1.1 History of cognitive mapping. Edward Tolman is famous for introducing the concept of cognitive map in psychology. With this concept he challenged the stimulus-response approach or physical perceptual approach to space that was prevalent until then. Although not a psychologist, Kevin Lynch has had a huge impact on developments in environmental psychology, particularly his sketch map method, and his work on structural elements of the city. The concepts of legibility and imageability developed by Lynch have important implications for environmental psychology and urban planning, given that humans tend to feel comforted when they are able to form clear cognitive maps and they are frightened when they feel lost. Another watershed event in the history of cognitive mapping was publication of an edited book called Image and Environment: Cognitive Mapping and Spatial Behavior by Downes and Stee, which is a classic text consulted by researchers even today. Two theorists who extended Lynch's work on cognitive mapping in environmental psychology were Kaplan and Donald Appleyard. Kaplan developed a model of environmental preference in which they tried to explain why different people perceive and map the same physical environment differently. They identified four aspects of the environment which are related to emotional experience, thus, coherence, legibility, complexity and mystery. According to Kaplan, elements in the environment related to coherence and legibility facilitate the observer in orienting themselves, whereas elements in the environment related to complexity and mystery influence the extent to which actors feel involved with the environment. Donald Appleyard explained that the imageability of a city is a product of two different group perceptions of ordinary planners and the planner citizens. According to Appleyard, mental maps need to be updated or reconstructed according to changes that happen on the face of the city. For instance, if a certain landmark which forms an anchor in people's cognitive map changes or disappears due to some natural calamity or destruction, then people's mental maps lose details of spatial knowledge built over so many years in the past, and the maps themselves become imprecise and vague. Appleyard linked cognitive maps to travel and showed that travelers who drove cars possessed more coherent cognitive maps than did those who took the bus. Some of these findings have had a bearing on later developments in cognitive mapping, especially post-cognitive neuroscience. 4.3.1.2 Methods of studying cognitive mapping. With rapid developments in technology and visualization techniques, many new methods have been developed to study cognitive mapping. Kevin Lynch's sketch map method is one of the most popular methods that has survived the test of time. Some of the other methods that have been employed are giving distance estimates, listing elements in a particular spatial field, navigating through an environment, etc. Some of the newer methods used to study cognitive mapping are discussed here. 4.3.1.2.1 Brain imaging techniques. Brain imaging techniques like electroencephalogram e.g., magnetic resonance imaging MI, functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI, and positron emission tomography PET scans are used to investigate the neural correlates of cognitive mapping and wayfinding. In research using MRI scans, Head and Eism, and Etchemendy and Bobbitt confirmed the finding of earlier brain lesion studies that the hippocampus is implicated in wayfinding, whereas the caudate nucleus is associated with route learning. Later research, for example, Morris and Parslow, demonstrated the role of extra-hippocampus structures such as the parahippocampus in wayfinding. In an interesting study design employing PET scans, Maguire et al. Asked experienced taxi drivers in London to describe the shortest route from a given point A to point B. The assumption was that spatial behavior in very familiar environments involves semantic memory. The results of the study showed that the hippocampus is involved in the processing of spatial layouts established over long time courses. Jansen and Jansen studied the brain's ability to differentiate useful from redundant or ambiguous wayfinding information in a virtual maze using fMRI readings. This study showed that the parahippocampal gyrus has an important role in responding to navigationally relevant objects even if briefly viewed. In a recent study, Sharma, Kaushal, Chandra, Singh, Mittal and Dutt used EEG techniques to study brain regions and processes that are utilized when people make use of landmarks in wayfinding in maze-like environments. They found that the left hemispheric region, especially the parietal cortex, is involved in the integration of sensory cues and memory to encode contextual information of landmarks. 4.3.1.2.2 Virtual reality. Immersive virtual reality (VR) is often considered as representative of actual environments, and virtual reality may be used to study wayfinding behavior in simulated environments to reduce design errors. Hewitt and Johnson from the University of Reading asked research participants to complete a wayfinding task in a familiar real environment and VR of the same building. The study showed a quantitative improvement in the route and time taken to complete the task. In another wayfinding study using VR, Ershad, Perkis and Azam investigated the perceived experiences of users in an immersive VR environment. Participants in the control condition were exposed to the VR with no wayfinding cues, and participants in the experimental groups were exposed to VR with static and dynamic wayfinding cues. Results showed that wayfinding cues reduced tension, produced positive effect in the experimental group as compared to the control group having to navigate VR without any wayfinding cues. Heart rate was significantly high in the control group. The applications of the study are that training people in high-risk emergency scenarios in immersive VR environments may improve their likelihood of survival in actual risky environments. 4.3.1.2.3 Space syntax. This method was developed in the University College London in the 1980s by Bill Hillier and his team. It links geometric attributes like line of sight, visual perception etc. with human behavior such as movement and occupation to generate a graphical representation of space. These graphical representations can then be quantitatively analyzed to determine the role of each spatial element in the configuration of the system as a whole or in its parts. Using space syntax analysis, environmental psychologists study the social antecedents and consequences of physical space like integration, migration, ghettoization etc. Hack carried out research in which volunteers performed open searches in large urban hospitals to become familiar. The hospitals were analyzed using space syntax measures. It was found that the depth of an entrance has an effect on wayfinding, and in the way the building is explored. Also, it was found that wayfinding and exploration was affected by lines of sight and by connectivity among spaces, all of which enhance the space intelligibility. This study demonstrates the use of space syntax techniques to understand the use of cognitive maps in wayfinding and configurational analysis. 4.3.1.2.4 Geographic Information System. A geographic information system (GIS) is a computer system for tagging, coding spatial information, visually representing such data and analyzing them to understand patterns and their relationships. Any position on the Earth's surface that has a location identifier in terms of latitude, longitude, pin code, zip code or address can be fed into the GIS and may be used to later to analyze, compare and contrast different geographical locations and the socio-demographic characteristics of people inhabiting such locations. Borst et al. Found using the GIS that elderly individuals are encouraged to walk by front gardens in streets and discouraged by litter, stairs or slopes along the way. Such information obviously has relevance for designing urban spaces as well as for geriatric psychology. Specifically with respect to wayfinding, Chen, Sato and Zheng investigated understanding of environmental information and wayfinding performance among travelers. They found that foreign travelers as compared to local travelers are more likely to use identifiable roads. Also, participants using paper maps were more likely to use obvious buildings as landmarks as compared to those using electronic maps. Familiarity with the navigation tool, paper/electronic map, resulted in lower walking time. 4.3.1.3 Errors in cognitive mapping. The concept of cognitive mapping or mental representation of the external environment is flawed because cognitive maps do not work on the same principle as cartographic maps. When people are asked to construct a mental map, they draw upon disparate sets of information about a place or route which has been acquired by a person over a period of time. The diverse pieces of information may not all be in visual format. They may be based on actual experience or upon stories heard about the place, and like all constructed material are dependent upon the vagaries of memory. Several distortions may creep into the cognitive mapping process because of the mental shortcuts or heuristics used by people. Vasky lists some of the following errors in cognitive mapping which may occur in isolation or in various combinations. First, the cognitive representation of space in memory is hierarchical, whereas the representation of the environment in maps is horizontal or two-dimensional. This introduces errors in cognitive mapping. In this respect, Vasky cited a study conducted by Hertel and Jonides in which participants were asked to form subjective groupings of buildings in town in terms of whether they were for commercial or educational purposes. Subjects were then asked to judge the distance between pairs of buildings. It was found that the distance between commercial versus educational buildings were overestimated relative to distances within the two functional groupings. This study thus provided evidence for the hierarchical structuring of cognitive maps, which leads to errors. Second, cognitive perspective or distances between nearby landmarks appear relatively larger than distances between faraway landmarks, though it is difficult to make adequate compensation for that. A similar phenomenon occurs in making distance judgments from memory. Third, the cognitive reference points humans have in mind when asked for direction, address, etc. is usually not an exact geographical reference point. Rather, people describe spatial environments in terms of places they think the audience may know. For example, if you were to ask someone of her postal address, she might say that she lives next to IGNU Campus Delhi, whereas if any foreigner were to ask the same thing, she might give them a complex set of directions with the Sakai Mall or Sakai Metro station as the landmark reference point. This process of describing lesser-known places in terms of their distance from landmarks introduces the error of asymmetric distance in mapping. Fourth, when two or many locations on a map are remembered relative to one another, there is a heuristic tendency to align them with one another, leading to errors. If superordinate units on a map, example, continents, are remembered as aligned, then the relative location of subordinate units, example, cities, will also be remembered as shifted. Fifth, cognitive mapping may suffer from rotation errors. When the orientation of a reference frame and an object are conflicted, there is a tendency to rotate the axis of the object towards the axis of the reference frame. This leads to rotation errors. There may be mistakes in cognitive maps because of incomplete information available for coding. A person may have no information coded for that part of the city where they have never been. Similarly, idiosyncratic experiences may lead to some parts of the city to be highlighted more than others. When individual cognitive mappers use incomplete information, systematic distortions may be seen on aggregate cognitive maps too. In cognitive mapping, all irregular geographic features may be smoothened. Turns and angles may be regularized to right angles. Distance judgments are usually not based on actual measurements. Approximations of distance lead to distortions creeping in. Distance is usually judged to be longer when there are barriers, turns or nodes, or even clutter along the road, anything which gives more intermediate information as compared to subjective judgments of equidistant locations with less information between them. The rule of thumb used is that routes must be longer if they have many locations along them. Other factors such as socioeconomic status and number of years of experience living in a city, mobility, etc. have implications for distortions that creep in cognitive mapping. Golge and Spector studied cognitive maps of Columbus, Ohio using a multidimensional scaling procedure and concluded that the amount of time people had lived in the city and their familiarity with specific locations were related to distortions on their cognitive maps. 4.3.2 Wayfinding. Wayfinding is an application of cognitive mapping and spatial cognition. According to Pacini, wayfinding includes all the mental processes which are involved in purposeful mobility. It involves moving intentionally from point A to point B, knowing when one has reached one's destination, and also being able to retrace one's way back to point A. Although wayfinding and navigation are used interchangeably, they are not the same. Navigation of a Google map, for example, involves updating the actor's location and rate of travel depending upon whether one is walking, cycling, using a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler, as the actor moves along a pathway towards a destination. Wayfinding, in contrast, involves selection of a particular path from among an existing network of routes, drawing up a relationship among the several paths as one travels, and choosing the best route depending upon one's objective/goal. According to Darkin and Peterson, wayfinding is the cognitive element of navigation. Wayfinding does not involve movement, whereas navigation is the combination of motion and cognitive wayfinding. 4.3.2.1 Characteristics of wayfinding. Wayfinding is an interdisciplinary area where cognitive psychology, graphic design, landscape architecture, urban planning, organizational behavior and many other fields converge and have contributed since the inception of the discipline. Behavioral elements involved in wayfinding that are of interest to environmental psychologists include skills, experiences, aptitude of people, as well as perceptual and cognitive processes. Behavioral skills relevant for wayfinding may be ability to read and follow signs, long-term and working memory, asking for directions, reading maps, forming a coherent sense of spatial layout, etc. Both individual level variables and situational factors may come into play in wayfinding. Wiseman has suggested 4 wayfinding strategies or styles that are based on behavioral perceptual cognitive elements. First, one may visually locate one's destination and trace one's way towards it steadily. This is especially useful for outside, medium to large spaces. Second, one may follow a cue towards a destination which may not be in one's visual field. For example, color-coded footprints on the floor of metro stations may help us find our way to the desired platform. This strategy is useful for medium to large complex spaces like railway stations, hospitals etc., as having too many cues may lead to sensory overload. Third, one may consult signages, landmarks along the way which provide direction and help the actor decide which path may lead to the desired destination, and which path may better be foregone. Lastly, a mental representation or cognitive map of the environment may be used. Design elements also have a very important role in ease or difficulty involved in wayfinding. For example, if the interior design elements do not have enough differentiation, it is difficult for people to tell where they are, and hence they may feel lost. Artworks, landmarks may serve as anchor points and help people find their way back. Similarly, signages, landmarks, and decision points, when well lit, contribute to wayfinding ease. 4.3.2.2 Equipment used in wayfinding. The earliest assistance humans received in wayfinding was probably by asking and receiving directions. The use of formal aids in wayfinding is traced to 300 to 200 BCE to the Chinese Han Dynasty, who used paper maps and naturally magnetized lodestone for wayfinding. Geographical paper map was first created by William Smith in the 18th century, and it is only in 1960 and 1976 that the Geographic Information System (GIS) and the Global Positioning Systems (GPS), which revolutionized wayfinding, were respectively developed. Wayfinding technology has evolved very rapidly since then, and today we have smartphones, auditory feedback devices, optical technologies and smart environments, all of which aid wayfinding behavior. Some of the contemporary equipments used in wayfinding are 4.3.2.2.1 maps. Despite advances in technology, paper maps continue to be popular methods of wayfinding. It is not uncommon for travelers to get a hold of city maps in order to navigate cities they are visiting. However, with advances in digital visualization techniques, online maps have also become extremely popular in everyday wayfinding. Online maps allow the map maker and the map reader to interact with maps actively and deal with large amounts of data. 4.3.2.2.2 Smartphones are probably the most popular wayfinding equipment used in everyday life these days. Smartphones enable GPS tracking, offer three-dimensional 3D street views virtually, and are also accompanied by ratings of different destinations by previous visitors. Smartphones may nudge the user to visit specific places by picking up information about past preferences. All of these are helpful in making wayfinding decisions. It may not be uncommon, for example, for your voice-guided smartphone to suddenly say Bai Temple within the next 100 meters, you may like to visit when you may be trying to find your way towards your destination. 4.3.2.2.3 Smart environments. Objects in the environment like signs, art pieces, hoardings etc. are fitted with software processors which are not visible to the naked eyes unless carefully observed. These processors are used to capture and process positioning information of people in the environment. 4.3.2.2.4 Dynamic Traffic Information Services. It makes use of advanced sensing technologies using which vehicle density on road at any particular time can be detected. Vehicles traveling at slow or high speed may be identified to predict the number of vehicles which may be present at any place at any given time, all helping in recording traffic flow, identifying possible road congestion etc. GPS, smartphones, mobile apps, Google Maps may be used to induct people in this informational network and also to supply real-time data that helps in wayfinding-related decisions. In India, a roadmap for dynamic traffic management based on real-time data was developed by Karturi Jain and Parakh in the city of Indore. The system can be clubbed with the existing traffic control system to manage traffic conditions in a better way. 4.3.2.2.5 Pedestrian Navigation Applications (PNAs) and Vehicle Navigation Systems (VNSs). These are mainly GPS-enabled mobile devices used in outdoor environments. PNAs facilitate wayfinding by providing assistance in space recognition, self-localization, etc. On an online map, the shortest /best pedestrian route is highlighted and audio instructions or text-based instructions guide pedestrians in reaching their destination. Additional attractions that lie alongside the route are also sometimes highlighted. For example, the attention of the pedestrian may be drawn to restaurants, restrooms, etc. by the PNA. PNAs function in a similar way like in-vehicle navigation systems, but they focus more on landmarks, provide more details apart from lanes and bylanes, and provide information on larger scales, all of which are relevant to walking but not to driving. In-vehicle navigation systems are more constrained by the network of main roads, and tend to ignore peripheral information. 4.3.2.2.6 Ubiquitous computing promotes real-time context awareness facilitated by the presence of computers in larger and larger radii of space. It facilitates human activities by way of automatic identification of real-world objects, places, and situations using digital codes. Diverse activities like monitoring of pets, operation of appliances, keeping track of books and vehicles may be carried out using this method. In India, CDAC Hyderabad, Chennai and Bangalore is the implementing agency for the Ubiquitous Computing Program with the support of institutions of academic eminence. IIM Kolkata, for example, has developed a pollution monitoring system. Amrita University has developed a wireless sensor network for real-time landslide monitoring, and a weather forecasting project is being implemented in Noida by CDAC, Pune. All of these have implications for wayfinding decisions to be made by humans. 4.3.2.2.7 Equipment for people with sensory impairment. Smart devices are sometimes tailor-made for people with impairments who may find it difficult to use smartphones, consult signages and generally pick up information from the environment. The talking laser cane, for example, may be used by people with visual impairment. Using signals emitted from retroreflective signs, this device provides auditory feedback, instructional or corrective guidance about the presence of objects that may obstruct the path from up to 10 m away, and help visually impaired people in wayfinding. Tactile grading may be used to help blind and people with low vision in wayfinding. The Delhi Metro Rail Corporation makes use of this facility. One question that remains is how wayfinding aids have affected cognitive mapping skills of humans. Although we do not have enough research evidence to arrive at any conclusions yet, research generally seems to show that technologically enabled wayfinding equipment have not led to any significant improvements. Ishikawa et al., for example, found that paper maps are more efficient as compared to GPS devices. Those who used a GPS device or relied upon direct experience stopped more times and traveled greater distances relative to individuals who used a paper map. However, driving behavior was significantly improved when using smartphone GPS than when using maps or onboard GPS systems. Also, overall, the effect of technological developments on cognitive functioning remains to be seen. 4.4 Summary. To sum up what we have learned in this unit, here is a quick recap. The process involved in apprehending the features of the environment is known as environmental perception. Environmental cognition involves formulating hypotheses, making further decisions, and working on goals based on information obtained through environmental perception. The emphasis of research in environmental perception has moved away from a focus on physical perceptual characteristics of the environment to a more social psychological understanding of the environment. Understanding of developmental processes related to environmental perception has shifted from ontogenetic, nativist, learning positions to a more integrated position which takes into account how ontogeny, neural maturation, environmental facilitation and cultural guidance, all come together to produce spatial development. A cognitive map is a mental representation of the spatial environment along with representation of key elements of the environment, relative locations etc. which help any individual navigate the space. The different methods of studying cognitive mapping are brain imaging, virtual reality, space syntax and geographic information systems. Various errors may creep into cognitive mapping due to hierarchical representation of space, cognitive perspective, cognitive reference point, alignment, rotation, systematic errors in memory and judgment due to gender, experience of living in a space, etc. Wayfinding involves moving intentionally from point A to point B, knowing when one has reached one's destination, and also being able to retrace one's way back to point A. The different equipment used in wayfinding are maps, smartphones, smart environments, dynamic traffic information services, pedestrian and vehicle navigation systems, ubiquitous computing and special equipment for people with sensory impairment.